Welcome back, Year 10. Today we're going to be looking at the Australian film industry. But before we dive straight in, I want you to just take a second and reflect on what you know about Australian films and our industry. How many Australian films can you think of? Were they popular films? Did you enjoy them? And what sort of story or stories were they telling? So we're going to try and explore those ideas a little bit further. We're going to be looking at the change in continuity of Australian films over time, and we're going to be looking at the significance of Australian films to our popular culture. So reflecting who we are as Australians and also shaping who we are as Australians. So we're going to start with the 1950s and 60s. So this was really the lowest point in Australia's filmmaking. During this period, no exclusively Australian films were produced. Cinema companies were really, their main focus was distributing Hollywood material, and that's because the actual cinemas were owned by overseas companies. If Australians did see an Australian film, it was probably this one, Jeddah. And even then, we still had, it wasn't exclusively Australian made, but it is telling an Australian story. Jeddah's important to our discussion today for a number of reasons. The first is it was actually the first all-colour movie made in Australia. So before that, we were only making black and white movies. So the change in technology allowed us to make this our first colour film. Secondly, it was the first film to actually feature Indigenous people as leading roles. So that's a pretty monumental milestone for us. And also it was the first time that we were hearing these stories about Indigenous people, Aboriginal people in white Australia and the struggles they were facing on the big screen. So it's the first time we were really being exposed to Indigenous perspectives. So then we move on to the 70s, and this was a really, really interesting period in Australian cinema. So Australians became fed up with the fact that they weren't hearing Australian stories on the big screen, and there was a growing interest in expanding Australian culture and exploring Australian stories. So this then led to the government actually providing funding to create film schools and really get some Australian films made. So this period is referred to as film revival or new wave cinema. And during this period, so the 70s, in the space of 10 years, we had 153 Australian feature films made. Some of the films were critically acclaimed movies, like this one, Picnic at Hanging Rock, or Walkabout, which explored some Indigenous issues. But we also had this other subgenre sort of emerge, and it really started to push the boundaries of Australian filmmaking. It explored themes like sex, horror, violence, action, and ochre comedy. So it really drew on stereotypes. And its main aim was to shock and excite the audiences. This genre here is called Ozploitation because it exploits Australian stereotypes. So we have Alvin Purple here. This one was rated R, and it's the first time the R rating was, so in the 70s the R rating came out. And Alvin Purple really explores some deeply sexual themes. Then we have Mad Max, which most of you should have at least heard of. It did really, really poorly in Australia, but when it went overseas, it was a box office smash hit. and it launched Mel Gibson's career, which is really interesting. So there was a whole series of these Ozploitation films made, and many pop culture historians argue that this little subgenre of films made in the 70s is maybe Australia's most defining aspect of popular culture. But definitely the films made in the 70s, there started to be a more diversity in the themes, and it reflected more of a confidence in Australian culture. So then we move on to the 80s, and here we see the Australian film industry, it just continued to thrive. So we had a lot of films made in this era started to portray stereotypical Australian male qualities like bravery, mateship, resourcefulness, larrikinism, and a general lack of respect for authority. And you can see that with Crocodile Dundee, he has a lot of those sort of qualities. We've got The Man from Snowy River, which deals with bravery and mateship and some of those themes. But there were examples that were contrary to this. So we had movies like Puberty Blues coming out, which actually focused on teenage girls and their initiation into the surfing culture of Australia. But on the whole, a lot of them tended to be focused on this. But even so, we still had the 80s was a time when Star Wars, Lethal Weapon, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, they were all coming out over from Hollywood. So these little Australian films had massive competition. Alright, so the 90s. I've got a fair bit to say about the 90s because it was a really interesting period in Australian film industry. So what was particularly interesting was the movies coming from Hollywood started to change. So they weren't just telling stories about the United States. They became more for a global audience. So we had films like The Matrix that didn't really have particular ties to any country. It was exploring a different sort of story. But then when we come to Australian-made films itself, these films really started to question the Australian identity, and they made us really reassess who we are as Australians. So we had films coming out like Muriel's Wedding and Strictly Ballroom, so very different films, but they both explore aspects of urban life in modern society. Then we had films like Romper Stomper. So Romper Stomper deals with some really serious racial issues surrounding a neo-Nazi blue-collar group from Melbourne. So very serious, and it's a different side of racial issues that we hadn't really seen before. And then this is probably one of the most controversial films that came out in the 90s, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. So it's about two drag queens and a transsexual from the city who make a journey through the outback to perform a show at Alice Springs. And this film really made people think about who we are as Australians, and it challenged our national values. So it was a really defining film. But on the whole, these are just a few of the Australian-made movies. On the whole, we became more exposed to diverse stories about what it means to be Australian. And those diverse stories dealt with issues such as people's ethnicity, class, race, religion, and sexual orientation. And these sort of stories were more than ever before in Australian film industry. So we're now in the 21st century, so we're still struggling to compete with Hollywood. And commentators are divided between whether this is due to the sorts of films that we're producing, or perhaps Australians have an escapist taste, which escapist taste means that we want to escape from reality. So we want to explore other themes than what we see around us every day. And this table here, this graph is from 2005 to 2009, so it's fairly recent. And you can see that the films released in Australia, we only had 7% of Australian-made films. The majority is American, with 55%. And then you can see we're still, like, Asia has a more influence over us than we do. So it's really interesting to see where our films actually fit in with the releases in Australia. But talking about actual films, so these are just a selection of some of the films that have come out. They're all really diverse and they tell distinctly Australian stories, but they're all very different, dealing with different aspects of society. So most of these ones have been very successful. Interestingly, these two, so Kenny and Samson and Delilah, they had really low budgets, but became box office smash hits and really made a lot of money for the Australian film industry. Okay, so hopefully you've got a bit of a sense now about the changes that happened over the different decades of Australian popular culture in relation to film. When we go to class, we're going to explore this a little bit further and get you using your higher order thinking skills. Don't forget to fill out the Google form with this so that we can really see how you've engaged with the content. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Bye!